There is a silence that does not echo, a silence so absolute that even light seems reluctant to cross it. And on the day humanity finally mapped the last corner of the observable universe and heard nothing, not a whisper of radio, not a flicker of structured energy, not a single photon bent by the will of another mind, that silence did not arrive like a tragedy. It arrived like a verdict. For centuries, humanity had searched. Not desperately, not frantically, but with the patient, methodical hunger of a species that had always believed, deep in the architecture of its curiosity, that it could not possibly be alone. The universe was too vast, too ancient, too mathematically generous with the conditions for life. The odds, every model agreed, were overwhelming. Contact was not a matter of hope, it was a matter of time. And so humanity waited and listened, and reached outward with probes and arrays and instruments of such breathtaking sensitivity that they could detect the thermal exhaust of a single candle burning on a moon orbiting a star 400 light-years away. They built ears the size of solar systems. They aimed those ears at everything, and the universe in its entirety said nothing back, not silence born of distance, not silence born of frequency mismatch or technological incompatibility. Silence born of absence. The probes did not return ambiguous data. They returned confirmation so thorough, so geometrically complete across 17 independent deep field surveys spanning 400 million light-years in every direction, that the scientists who received the final compilation did not argue about the numbers. They stared at them because the numbers were not a mystery, they were an answer, and the answer was this: humanity had not failed to find other civilizations. Humanity had outlasted them all. Welcome to Beyond Impossible, the channel where we do not look away from the unthinkable, where the stories we tell are not fantasies, but warnings, meditations, and declarations written in the language of science and the ink of human will. Tonight, we do not ask whether humanity can survive the cosmos. Tonight, we ask something far more terrifying. What does humanity become when the cosmos belongs entirely to it? What is the weight of infinite inheritance? What do you do with a universe and no one left to share it with? Stay with us. This is the story of the last civilization. The probe was called Anamnesis-7, and it was the oldest human-made object still functioning in the universe. Launched 11,000 years ago from an orbital foundry above what had once been called Jupiter, it had traveled so far from the ecliptic plane of humanity's home system that the sun itself was no longer individually distinguishable to its optical sensors, just another point of light in a field of 10 billion. Its hull was pitted by the accumulated impacts of interstellar dust, its communication array rebuilt 17 times by the self-repairing nanofabric that lined its interior skeleton, its power core still humming on a quantum cascade reactor that humanity's engineers had designed to outlast geological epochs. When Anamnesis-7 transmitted its final deep field confirmation back toward the inner systems, the signal took 412 years to arrive. When it did, it landed in the receiver arrays of the Hegemony's Astrophysical Continuity Bureau on Laniakea Station, a structure so large it generated its own measurable gravitational signature, and it ended an argument that humanity had been having with itself for longer than most of its current civilizations had existed. Director Salanvara read the compilation 3 times before she called the emergency session. She was 190 years old, biologically maintained at the physical peak of her late 30s by cellular regeneration protocols that had rendered natural aging essentially voluntary, and in those years she had processed more astrophysical data than any human being in recorded history. She had overseen the confirmation of 17 previously theoretical cosmic phenomena. She was not a person given to emotional display, or to doubt, or to the particular paralysis that afflicts minds confronted with information they are not structurally prepared to absorb. But when she set down the Anamnesis-7 report and looked out through the station's observation membrane at the stars, at the vast, unbroken, achingly beautiful field of stars, her hands were trembling. The emergency session convened within 6 hours. 43 representatives of humanity's 11 major civilizational branches filled the chamber, projected in real time from stations and habitats and colony worlds spanning 40 light-years via quantum entanglement relay. Chief Analyst Darren Ackafer presented the data without preamble because there was no framing that would make it land gently. He laid out the 17 surveys. He walked through the spectral analysis of 462 previously candidate-bearing star systems. He presented the thermal decay signatures of what had once been 17 distinct type III civilizations, each now reduced to the cold arithmetic of entropy, their megastructures dark, their signals silent, their last transmissions so ancient that the stars those signals had passed through had since collapsed into stellar remnants. He spoke for 40 minutes. When he finished, no one in the chamber said anything for a long time. It was Representative Yale Morrow of the Outer Reaches Collective who finally broke the silence, and she did not do it with a question about the data, or a request for verification, or a procedural motion. She looked directly into the relay lens and said very quietly that she wanted to know what they were supposed to feel. And the chamber, for a moment, had no answer, because this was not the end of humanity. It was something stranger, and in many ways harder. It was the beginning of humanity's absolute solitude in a universe so incomprehensibly large that solitude itself had taken on the dimensions of a cosmic condition. The impossible situation was not that humanity faced extinction. It was that humanity faced eternity, alone. The hegemony's first official response to the Anamnesis-7 confirmation was, by the standards of civilizational crisis management, remarkably orderly. Within 72 hours of the emergency session, Director Vara had convened the Bureau's full analytical division, requisitioned processing time on Laniakea Station's primary quantum computation array, and issued a system-wide data sequencing delay, not a suppression, she was careful to specify, but a measured hold designed to allow the scientific community to construct a coherent explanatory framework before the confirmation reached the broader public through open relay networks. She understood with the clarity of long institutional experience that the difference between information and catastrophe is almost always context. Raw data delivered into a vacuum does not inform, it detonates. The scientific community did not wait for permission to begin fracturing. Within 48 hours, 3 competing interpretive schools had formed along the fault lines of existing theoretical disagreement. The gradualists argued that the extinction pattern was consistent with the long-predicted thermodynamic ceiling, that sufficiently advanced civilizations inevitably reach a point of energy consumption that destabilizes their host stellar environments, triggering cascading gravitational collapse events their own megastructural engineering cannot survive. The catastrophists contended that the simultaneity of the extinction signatures, all 17 civilizations showing terminal decay indicators within the same 300 million year cosmological window, was statistically incompatible with independent failure and pointed instead toward a single universe-scale extinction event of unknown origin, something that had swept through the observable universe and left humanity alive only because humanity had not yet been visible enough to register as a target. The transcendentalists proposed quietly and with complete mathematical seriousness that the civilizations were not dead, that they had crossed a threshold of complexity beyond current detection capability, and that the universe was not empty but operating at a frequency humanity had not yet learned to hear. Ackafer did not belong to any of these schools. He belonged to the data, which was his way of saying he trusted nothing he could not verify and nothing he could not falsify, and that the evidence supported exactly one conclusion with scientific confidence. The civilizations were gone, everything else was philosophy dressed in the language of astrophysics. The public confirmation came on the 9th day. Vara delivered it herself from Laniakea Station's main address platform, her voice carried simultaneously across every open relay channel in human space. She was precise, measured, and honest in a way that cost her something visible to anyone watching closely. She confirmed the findings. She confirmed their scope, and then she departed from every prepared remark her communications team had spent 9 days refining. She said that humanity had always defined itself in relation to the possibility of others, that the search itself had been a form of self-understanding, a way of asking what it meant to be conscious, to matter in a cosmos that did not hand out meaning freely. Now, with the search over and the answer received, humanity faced the one question no civilization had ever been required to answer from a position of absolute certainty. Not whether they were alone, but what they were going to do about it. What followed was not panic. It was something more difficult to manage, a civilizational vertigo that manifested differently across every branch of humanity, but drew from the same root source. The framework that had quietly organized human ambition for millennia, the assumption that the universe was populated and fundamentally a shared space, had not merely been challenged. It had been empirically dissolved. And when the organizing assumption of a species disappears, what rushes into the vacuum is not immediately coherent. On the inner colony worlds, philosophical and religious institutions that had spent centuries reconciling faith with the expectation of cosmic companionship now rebuilt their foundational architectures publicly, under pressure from populations that wanted answers faster than genuine reflection could produce them. On the outer stations and deep space habitats, the response was more immediately practical. If humanity was alone, then every stellar body in cubic light-year of space was in principle available, and the political and economic implications of that availability were staggering. Territorial frameworks built on the assumption of eventual contact, legal structures designed with interspecies negotiation in mind, all of it required fundamental revision, and every faction within human civilization had a different vision of what that revision should look like. The Continuity Bureau tracked 17 civilizational stress indicators across human space, and by the end of the first year, 14 had moved outside their historical normal ranges. It was Achafer who first identified what he called the secondary crisis embedded within the primary one, and he brought it to Vara not as a report but as a conversation, because he understood that what he was about to say could not be easily filed or processed. The Anamnesis-7 data contained something beyond the extinction confirmation, something present in the spectral return of every dead civilization's remnant signature, so consistent across all 17 events that its consistency was itself a data point of the highest order. Every civilization, regardless of its technological epoch or biological profile, had at some point in its terminal phase redirected the totality of its remaining energy output toward a single project. Not survival. Not war, not resource extraction. Something that structural resonance mapping identified as deliberate, coordinated, and outward directed. Something that looked, Achafer said carefully, like a message. 17 civilizations at the moment of their ending had spent their last energy trying to say something, and not one of those messages had arrived. The universe had not only taken everyone else, it had taken their final words. And now Vara understood why her hands had been trembling, because the real weight of the Anamnesis-7 confirmation was not that humanity was alone. It was that humanity might be the only mind left in the universe capable of deciding whether that silence was the end of the story, or simply the end of its first chapter. The proposal came from the most unexpected source, not from the Bureau or the Hegemony Strategic Council, but from a xenolinguist named Caelum Brandt, 43 years old, working from a mid-tier research station orbiting the remnant of Betelgeuse. He had spent 20 years constructing a universal grammar, a mathematical language architecture so fundamental in its reliance on physical constants and geometric inevitabilities that any sufficiently complex mind, regardless of its biological or computational substrate, would recognize it as intentional. He had published 11 papers on the subject, received with the respectful indifference reserved for work considered beautiful but practically irrelevant. Then the Anamnesis-7 Confirmation arrived, and his 11 papers became the most downloaded documents in the hegemony's scientific archive overnight, because suddenly the question of how to communicate across radical cognitive difference was not theoretical. It was the only question that mattered. His proposal, the Resonance Inheritance Initiative, was formally simple and staggering in equal measure. Brandt was not proposing that humanity search for survivors or attempt contact because there was no one left to contact. He was proposing that humanity attempt to recover the final transmissions of the 17 extinct civilizations, not passively, but actively, by exploiting a phenomenon his grammar research had identified almost as a byproduct. That structured, intentional information encoded in gravitational wave patterns degrades at a measurably slower rate than electromagnetic transmission across cosmological distances. The terminal energy outputs of the extinct civilizations, if directed with sufficient precision, might have left gravitational imprints still recoverable from the geometric structure of spacetime itself. The messages were not lost in the way a signal is lost when it disperses below noise threshold. They were encoded in the fabric of the universe below electromagnetic visibility, waiting for an instrument capable of reading them. Humanity had the mathematics to build that instrument. It had never had a reason to try. Now it did. 17 of the most capable theoretical physicists in human space were given unrestricted access to Brandt's complete research archive and asked to find the flaw. They worked for 30 days. What they found instead was that the mathematics was sound, rigorously, uncomfortably, peer-review survivably sound. Recovery was not guaranteed, but was not physically prohibited. Akafer reviewed the final evaluation summary, and then sat alone in his office for a long time, thinking about 17 civilizations spending their last energy on a message, and about the audacity required to reach into the structure of space itself and pull them out. Then he walked to Vara's office and told her that humanity had just found its purpose, and that it was going to be the hardest thing their species had ever attempted, and that he believed they were going to do it anyway. The Resonance Inheritance Initiative was ratified by all 11 civilizational branches in a joint session that took 4 months to negotiate and 17 minutes to conclude, because by the time the final vote was called, there was no meaningful opposition left. Not because dissent had been suppressed, but because the alternative, inheriting a universe full of unread final words and making no effort to hear them, had proven to be a position humanity could not sustain emotionally or philosophically. The species that had crossed interstellar distances on the strength of its refusal to accept ignorance as a permanent condition was not capable of sitting in the inheritance of an entire universe and choosing silence. Construction of the Meridian Array began 11 months after ratification, in the gravitationally stable outer boundary of Laniakea Station's Oort cloud analog, where interference from the inner system's electromagnetic activity dropped to levels Brandt's detection models required. The array was not a single structure, but a distributed network of 144 gravitational wave receivers, each maintained at tolerances measured in fractions of a Planck length by continuous quantum error correction systems, drawing more computational power than humanity's entire inner colony infrastructure combined. Their geometric arrangement encoded Brandt's universal grammar directly into the array's spatial architecture, so that the instrument itself was simultaneously a detector and a declaration, a message in the shape of an ear, broadcasting humanity's mathematical signature into the gravitational medium, even as it listened for the echoes of the dead. It took 6 years to build. In the third year, a cascading resonance failure in the error correction network of 47 receivers invalidated 2 years of calibration data. Chief Engineer Saren Obi led the recalibration effort from inside the array's central coordination habitat, working in an environment where the gravitational wave sensitivity of the surrounding receivers was high enough that walking across the habitat floor produced a measurable signal artifact. The team worked in near-complete stillness for 19 days, communicating in text rather than speech, moving with the deliberate economy of people who understood that their own physical existence was an interference pattern they were obligated to minimize. When the recalibration held, Obi did not celebrate. She checked the numbers 4 more times, then sat on the habitat floor and pressed her palms flat against the surface, feeling, she said later, like she was pressing her hands against something pressing back. The array achieved first operational status in the 6th year, and the initial detection sweep was conducted across the gravitational frequency bands Brandt's models identified as highest probability for directed terminal transmissions. For 11 days, the data returned was consistent with background gravitational noise, the cosmic murmur of merging neutron stars and orbiting black hole pairs. On the 11th day, in the 417th hour of continuous operation, a pattern emerged from the noise with the quiet, unmistakable authority of something that had been waiting a very long time to be found. A geometric recursion encoded in the local curvature of spacetime, repeating at intervals governed by a ratio that appeared in Brandt's universal grammar as the most fundamental expression of intentional communication possible. The relationship between a circle and its radius, rendered in the language of gravity. Someone had written in the universe, and humanity had just learned to read. The message's opening structure translated with terrible and beautiful clarity into a single imperative that 17 civilizations had spent their last energy encoding, all of them independently arriving at the same words. Do not let it end here. The full decryption of the 17 terminal transmissions took 8 months, and in those months Caelum Brandt worked with the concentrated, almost devotional intensity of someone who understood that what was passing through his hands was not data in any ordinary sense. It was the distilled final intention of 17 civilizations, each one older than humanity's entire recorded history, each one reduced by the arithmetic of entropy to nothing but this. A geometric whisper pressed into the fabric of spacetime with the last energy they possessed, aimed at no one in particular, addressed to whoever came after, sustained across hundreds of millions of years by the only medium in the universe that does not forget. The messages were not identical, but they converged. Across 17 distinct cognitive architectures and 17 separate histories, the terminal transmissions arrived at the same essential content with a consistency that Achafer described as the most statistically significant result in the history of science. They were not warnings, they were not laments. They were instructions, detailed, precise, and in several critical respects so far beyond humanity's current technological horizon that the interpretation teams worked not with the confidence of engineers reading a manual, but with the humbled attention of students encountering a mathematics they could follow but not yet fully inhabit. What the 17 civilizations had collectively encoded was a blueprint, not for survival in the conventional sense, but for the only response to the universe's fundamental thermodynamic trajectory that was not, in the end, a form of surrender. The universe was dying, stars would exhaust their fuel. black holes would evaporate through Hawking radiation across timescales that made the current age of the universe look like an opening breath. The cosmic microwave background would cool toward absolute zero. The lights would go out one by one across a span of time so incomprehensible that the number of zeros required to express it exceeded the number of atoms in the observable universe. What the extinct civilizations had each discovered, independently and in their final hours, was that the entropic gradient was not a wall but a slope, that at sufficient scales of directed gravitational engineering, a civilization willing to commit its entire remaining existence to cosmic renewal could introduce perturbations into the distribution of mass and energy sufficient to restart stellar formation in regions where it had ceased. To delay the evaporation of black holes whose gravitational energy could power the project across the eons required to keep the lights on. Not forever, but immeasurably, almost inconceivably longer. Each had discovered this, and each had lacked the time and resources to begin. So they had written it down in the most durable medium in existence, aimed it at the future, and trusted that someone would come. Director Vara presented the compiled translations to the full joint session without minimizing what she was asking. The project was not a mission or a program in any sense existing institutional frameworks could accommodate. It required humanity to think of itself not as competing branches and political entities, but as a single continuous project, sustained across timescales that would see the current form of human civilization replaced by descendants so transformed by time and adaptation that their connection to the present moment would be as tenuous as humanity's connection to the first organisms that crawled from the ocean onto land. She laid this out plainly, and then she said that the question before the hegemony was not whether humanity was capable of the project in its final form. The question was whether humanity was capable of beginning it, whether the species that had outlasted every other civilization in the observable universe had the courage required not for a single impossible act, but for an impossible commitment. The vote took 3 days, was not unanimous, and the dissenting voices were serious and heard with full respect. And then humanity voted yes, not because success was guaranteed across timescales no current human mind could genuinely comprehend, but because the alternative was to receive the most extraordinary message in the history of conscious life, written in the geometry of spacetime by 17 civilizations at the moment of their extinction, saying do not let it end here, and to respond with nothing. And humanity in the end was not capable of nothing. It never had been. In the millennia that followed, the Meridian Array became the foundation of a detection and communication network spanning a significant fraction of the observable universe's accessible volume. The first gravitational engineering projects began reshaping the mass distribution of stellar nurseries where star formation had started to decline. New stars ignited in the dark, not many at first. But the universe, for the first time in its long history, had a gardener, a civilization that had inherited its silence and responded not with grief or fear or paralysis, but with the patient, luminous, fundamentally human refusal to let the lights go out without a fight. There is a question that every civilization in the observable universe eventually asked itself. The Meridian Array's translations confirmed it across 17 distinct cognitive architectures and 17 separate histories. The question is not whether the universe is hostile, or whether entropy wins in the end, or whether the darkness between stars is a threat or simply a condition. The question, the one that every civilization reaches when it has lived long enough and looked far enough and understood deeply enough, is this. Knowing everything that you know, knowing how it ends, knowing the scale of what you are up against, do you try anyway? 17 civilizations asked that question and ran out of time before they could answer it with anything more than hope and mathematics pressed into the geometry of spacetime. Humanity asked it in a chamber on Laniakea Station with the weight of an entire universe in the room, and answered it in 3 days, and then got to work. That is not a small thing. In a universe 13 billion years old, populated across its entire history by civilizations of breathtaking complexity and reach and intelligence, not one of them survived long enough to begin the project their own final wisdom identified as the only answer worth giving. Humanity did, not because humanity is perfect or invulnerable or possessed of some cosmic destiny written into its DNA, but because humanity is, at its irreducible core, the species that looks at the impossible and decides that the impossibility is the most interesting part. The universe is vast beyond the capacity of any single mind to genuinely hold. It is ancient beyond the reach of any history that fits comfortably into language. It is dying slowly along a gradient that will eventually extinguish every star and silence every frequency, and reduce every structure to the cold, featureless equilibrium that physicists call the heat death and poets call the last dark. And somewhere in that universe, tending the stellar nurseries at the edge of a galaxy that was once called the Milky Way, working from blueprints written by the extinct in the language of gravity and inherited by the stubborn and the curious and the irreducibly alive, humanity is keeping the lights on. One star at a time, across timescales that make the word patience feel inadequate, with the particular joy of a species that has always understood, somewhere below the level of articulation, that the point was never to survive the universe, the point was to be worth the universe's having produced you. Humanity received the last message of every civilization that came before it, and the message said, "Do not let it end here." And humanity looked out at the dying cosmos and said, with the full weight of everything it was and everything it intended to become, "We heard you. We are here and we are just getting started." This has been beyond impossible, where the stories we tell are not about what humanity fears, but about what humanity does when the fear is justified and the odds are impossible, and the only thing left is the decision. If this story moved something in you, if it made the universe feel larger and your place in it more consequential, then it did exactly what it was built to do. Subscribe so you never miss the next chapter. Leave a comment because your voice in this conversation matters more than you know. And carry this with you, wherever you go in the vast and extraordinary and still unfinished story of what it means to be human, that somewhere out there, in the geometry of a universe that does not hand out meaning freely, meaning was found anyway. By us, as it always has been, beyond impossible, we will see you among the stars.